Welcome to Casual Conversations on Education. Today, our guest is Joanna Vanhof from Cardus. Cardus is a public policy think tank dedicated to clarifying and strengthening ways in which society's institutions can work together for the common good. The Education Department of Cardus exists to cultivate education for the common good and to convene education leaders. And how do they do that? Through original research and policy studies on educational pluralism and graduate outcomes, particularly in Canada and the US. And we're going to talk about one of those excellent original research projects just in a moment. And with us today, as mentioned, is Joanna Vanhof, who is the Program Director of Education at Cardus. Joanna, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I had a quick look at your CV, and you have a master's degree in education. You're finishing your PhD in educational leadership and policy. You now work in education. You're an education researcher. What shaped your passion for education?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I've always had a love for education. I grew up in a family where education was really valued and questions were always welcome. So I think that early on, my parents instilled that in me and in my siblings as well. So it's always been there. And then I would say my experiences throughout my early childhood education, but particularly my university experiences, really formed and shaped me into loving to learn and loving to continue to learn. So that drove me into education and wanting to be able to give those experiences to others at first as an educator and leader in education. Um, and then in going back to study kind of broader issues within the education landscape, more policy and governance issues really interested me as well.
Mhm. Amazing. I also grew up a bit in a, my mom is a teacher. So
Yes.
it does shape us like, a little bit. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
okay. Before we go into the findings of the recent Cardus education survey, which will be probably the most part of the conversation, I am going to take advantage that I'm talking to a Canadian. You're the first Canadian that we are interviewing. So, for those of us who don't know much about the Canadian system, what would you say are barriers that exist to accessing educational freedom in the country? And then maybe linking it to Cardus, what research is Cardus doing to address some of those issues?
Sure. So I think one thing that is often not understood about the Canadian education system is that there is no national Department of Education or federal oversight of education. So education in Canada is governed by the provinces. Each province has its own education system. And so access to education varies significantly across the country depending on where you live. Um, and I think in general, there are some areas in Canada where that are highly known for their equitable and high performing education systems. But I would say what is often missed in those systems are students who attend schools that fall outside of the public system. Education in Canada, even in the public system, is more pluralist than in the United States. So there's not a single district system in each province. Each province manages that differently, and some, due to historical constitutional arrangements, have provided for Catholic or French language education within the public system. However, outside of that, there may not be provision for support. There is in some provinces, particularly the Western provinces, have some support for independent schooling outside of Catholic and French language schools.
Okay.
But in Ontario, for example, which is the highest populated province, there is no funding or support for any other type of independent school. So access to the kinds of education and to educational freedom or the options for education that align perhaps with a family's values or that align with a particular pedagogical orientation is difficult. And it's also increasingly difficult for special needs students with high needs to obtain access to the kinds of supports that they need. So we've seen an increase across the country, in particularly in recent years, but over the last steady increase over the last 20 years of students accessing independent schooling options. But those barriers exist in different forms across the country. And I would say in Ontario, where there's the highest raw population of independent schools, almost 106 students, almost 160,000 students are educated outside of public systems, that access is difficult because there is no funding provided. So families need to be able to make those sacrifices themselves, and it can be very difficult. So those are things that we would like to see changed. And then the work that Cardus does, I think we'll never run out of research projects because the data that exists, it's not very well understood, these independent school communities and landscapes across the country. So that is some of the work that we do, is just helping to increase awareness of independent schools and independent school communities across the country. The role of independent school associations is something that we're interested in. The characteristics of independent schools and their outcomes, their performance across the country. These are all research projects that we have ongoing.
And it's so valuable because also with the work with Oidel, we do see that sometimes, yeah, there's not even a common basis where the conversation can start because the independent schools are not very well understood. So I think it helps to have to at least have the conversation to first understand who are they, what are their barriers, what are their, their wins, how can we work with them to then actually have the conversation after. But it's difficult to have that if we don't actually understand the landscape of them. So yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's one of the challenges that we face frequently, is that the sort of typical understanding that exists is that these are wealthy, very wealthy schools and students, but that's just not the case
Yeah.
because they're not understood. And so I think even in the international data, I would say that does exist on private schools, it's likely not representative of the actual what is on the ground. So
Okay. So that was Canada. Now let's move
yeah.
to the US. Cardus did, like mentioned before, you did the Cardus Education Survey, which is a very, very comprehensive, a large survey that has been done at several points every so
Mhm.
and so years. Can you just to start in a nutshell, what does the CES want to get at? What is the big question behind? And then also, who should be attentive to this research?
Yes, thank you. So the Cardus Education Survey originated, I think our first iteration of that was done in 2011. So it's been around for quite some time. It's been done about every 3 years, and we have done this in Canada, in the US, as well as one round we did in Australia. It is a survey of graduates of various sectors of schooling, so public school graduates, as well as private school graduates, Catholic school graduates, Protestant school graduates, non-religious school graduates, and then homeschooling. So those 5 sectors are represented and surveyed. The most recent iteration that we did was in the US. So the survey is a representative sample of US graduates aged 24 to 39. I think there were 2,350 respondents to the survey. And the survey really looks at life outcomes across a variety of outcomes. So it doesn't just look at educational attainment or at employment outcomes, which I think are typical for looking at schooling outcomes, but it also looks at things like civic outcomes, like volunteering. It looks at life satisfaction and overall high school experience. And it also, this iteration, looked at mental health outcomes as well as family outcomes. So there's a comprehensive understanding of what is the picture of a graduate after they have left their high school years, and we are asking the question, what was the good that their schooling contributed to their current life outcomes? And so I think in terms of who should pay attention to this research, one of the really unique offerings of this research is that I think most research that looks at outcomes doesn't look at it this comprehensively.
Yeah.
And also it offers something new then to the data that does exist, particularly because it also really offers a perspective on educational pluralism. Why does
Mm,
pluralism matter, and what is the good of it in terms of
mm,
the outcomes for these graduates?
mm,
And so positive outcomes compared to their public school counterparts suggest that educational pluralism is a healthy and a fruitful way to structure educational systems
mm,
um, around the world, we would hope. Yeah.
mm. You mentioned, I love that. I mean, it's so great and it's so needed. It also, I like the word that you said, life outcomes. And you mentioned the question, what is the good the schooling has contributed to the graduate's life? And I think that's so, I, it goes also, to me, it also goes into, or the value there is that we don't just want, yeah, we don't just want adults or citizens that are just has a lot of no have a lot of knowledge, but there's more to that. And it also relates, I think, with the Cardus mission of the common good. And the yeah, can you
Yes.
maybe speak a bit more to that, the relationship there with like why should we care about civic outcomes? Why should we care about yeah, the
For,
volunteering or these kind of things?
yeah, for sure. That's excellent. Yes. So it not only does it speak to like the personal well-being of each graduate, but I think life outcomes are also an indicator of the social contributions that
Mm,
these graduates are able to make. And certainly, Cardus's orientation, we are rooted in the Christian social thought tradition. And so the reason that we care so deeply about educational pluralism, I would say, is really rooted in two principles. The first is that every human being is created and has God-given dignity, and therefore deserves to have an education that fits and aligns with their values or their perspectives or their needs, that is
mm,
very particular and personal. At the same time, we deeply believe humans are made for community, and that education always has, therefore, a social or a public impact. So it is not just, even when education happens in the home, it is not education simply for oneself and for one's own success. It is education so that someone can be a contributing member of a community, of a society, and help to build that society in healthy and functioning ways. So that is the common good piece of the
mm,
orientation that I think this survey also speaks to, that these outcomes, civic outcomes, life satisfaction outcomes, also suggest that all of these different kinds of schooling sectors do have a positive contribution to make to the public good. And in that sense, they can all be considered public education. They're
yeah,
educating the public.
yeah. Which is a whole nother debate. What is public
Yes,
education
it
exactly?
is. Yes, it is.
We try to avoid that term, public education. We prefer
So
education
do we,
as a
actually.
public good, but yeah, it's there's still some work to do there. Okay, wonderful. Before we go into the some of the findings of what you yeah what the survey kind of revealed, can you just explain a bit more of the methodology, because I think it's important to understand how you did the surveys and who are the people and over what time to then really understand also the value of the findings.
Sure, yes. So the survey was conducted in the late 2023 by Ipsos Reid. We partnered with and used their knowledge panel. So it's a nationally representative sample of respondents ages 24 to 39. And those respondents, they have all attended, for the majority of their high school years, a particular sector of schooling. So whether that was public schooling or a form of just private schooling, independent schooling, so whether that was Catholic schools or Protestant schools or non-religious independent schools. All of them indicated in the survey that they had been attending those schools for the majority of their high school years. And they were pulled on a variety of different questions, as I mentioned, across those different kinds of outcomes. And the results then were regression analysis was performed in order to understand the comparative results of their responses against their public school counterparts. And so I can put the link to the study in the chat if people would like to read about it more
Yeah, definitely. So we
in
can also add it
depth.
in the, we posted on, this is on YouTube, so you will find it
Okay, great.
in
Yeah,
the description, show notes, or how they
great.
call it.
Okay, great. So then, yes, so that the fact that it is a nationally representative sample means that the sample of the data, the quality of the data is very high,
Mm.
and the methodology, I think, that was used. There was also we controlled for other confounding factors, so things like respondents' age, whether they lived in poverty as a child, their race, their gender, their religious background was controlled for, as well as their mother's education. So that was done in order to gain a sense of, well, what was this actual school effect? Can we isolate a school effect out of the simply the raw responses that we obtained? So all of those controls were put in place, as well as, I think, family structures. So whether respondents lived with both biological parents at the time that they were in school as well.
Mm-hmm.
So those controls help to isolate a school effect in particular. And I think when interested folks read the study, the way that the graphs are represented, you can see that there's sort of a raw effect against public schools, and then a school effect right beside it that is usually reduced once those controls are in place. And then statistical significance is indicated as well.
Mm-hmm.
For each outcome.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Yeah, so much work. Sounds like a lot of work, but sounds like
Yes,
needed work. So I think what I really appreciate, and if I understand correctly, is like there's the very yeah, well, there's these control variables to really get to the school effect, and yeah, just so you survey adults how they volunteer now, how they are donating now, how they are working now, and then relate that to, or yeah, the school sector they did their high school in, and kind of see the connections there. Yeah, would that be?
that's right.
Yeah.
Yes, that's
Okay.
right. Yeah.
Okay. For the findings, what what did you find? Or maybe let's go. So I think the word here is the school sector effect. That's what you said. So
Yes.
there's this five kind of type of schools you look at. Well, public schools, one of them, and then the other four you mentioned. And then you look at the specific effects of each school type to the graduate outcomes, and these outcomes being, well, with a holistic approach, like you mentioned, the mental health, relational, cultural, spiritual, and so on. Um, I know there's a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of findings. What would you like to highlight?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think the main takeaway would be that for across the board, for almost every outcome, every sector, every sector performed as well or better than their public school counterparts. There's a few scenarios where there was lower outcomes than their public school counterparts, but for the vast majority of questions that we asked, all of these schooling sectors performed as well or better than their public school counterparts, which I think speaks to just the quality and the validity, really, of a variety of different sectors of schooling. So that would be sort of the main takeaway, I think, that there wasn't one particular schooling sector that, you know, sort of tanked on all of the outcomes or
Yeah.
anything. But yeah, there was this real sense that these different types of schooling do have positive outcomes and do contribute and lead to healthy life outcomes for those who attend them. There were definitely some variations by sector. I think I would say Catholic schooling and non-religious independent schooling performed particularly well across almost every area, and that was sort of an interesting finding. I think it's consistent with what we've seen in prior iterations, particularly for Catholic schooling. So there's some sort of secret magic maybe there. And then there's things like, for example, Protestant schools did not perform as well on overall high school experience when graduates were asked about what was their overall high school experience or their experience of belonging in high school. Protestant schools were sort of equal to their public school counterparts, whereas Catholic schools and non-religious independent schools performed higher. So in some cases, there's things for different schooling sectors to think about and to work on as well, room for improvement. In terms of employment outcomes, an interesting finding was that non-religious independent schools graduates as well as homeschoolers were less likely to be working at the time. So whether that speaks to income, we also found that non-religious independent school graduates had a much higher income or a higher income than other graduates. But that wasn't the case for homeschooling. But
Okay.
both of them were more likely not to be working or employed at the time. So what that exactly speaks to, what the dynamic is there that's going on, is a little bit unsure. We're kind of getting into speculation, but that could be just different values around family, maybe for some of homeschooling communities, or it could be just that clearly the higher income was not a barrier in terms of not working for non-religious independent schools
Mhm.
graduates. Um, some of the other really positive outcomes for Protestant and for Catholic schooling communities in particular were civic and volunteering around civic outcomes. So volunteering and charitable giving was higher across the board actually but particularly for Protestant school graduates as well as homeschool graduates. Charitable giving and volunteering were very high. So their contributions to civic life are notable. And another interesting finding, I would say, or interesting, or maybe it's not necessarily unexpected, given I think the current environment, but in terms of mental health outcomes, depression and anxiety, there was no real
Mhm.
difference for any sector from their public school counterparts. And so that seems to not be something, it seems to be something that is sort of equal across the board um, in terms of mental health outcomes.
Mhm.
There was some improvement in mental health outcomes in terms of life satisfaction responses for those students who were Protestant or who were homeschooled,
Okay.
but very little kind of variation there. Um, and then all of the faith formation questions that we asked, these were highest among Protestant school graduates and homeschool graduates.
Okay.
One caveat that I would add to the homeschooling outcomes is, so we did a follow-up study that just looked at our homeschooling group. And so that might also be something to link in the show notes later, because once we disaggregated our homeschool respondents into long-term respondents and long-term homeschoolers and short-term homeschoolers, there was a real distinction in terms of the outcomes. So short-term homeschoolers had very similar, the basic takeaway is that short-term homeschoolers, which would be homeschoolers who were homeschooling maybe for 1 or 2 years, had very similar outcomes to public school counterparts, whereas long-term homeschoolers who were maybe homeschooling
Interesting.
for 12 to 13 years, so their entire career, had much different and much more significantly positive outcomes, uh,
Interesting.
and similar to Protestant and Catholic school counterparts. So that's sort of a caveat to the homeschool
Yeah.
responses in the original survey, because it really depends how long they've been homeschooling um, for the outcomes, like what the outcomes actually are.
Yeah. I think,
And I think,
mhm. Go
sorry,
ahead.
no, that I think that makes sense, right? If you have really only
Yeah.
exited a public system for 1 or 2 years, it's more likely that your responses will look very similar to your public school counterparts.
Yeah. No, so interesting. Thank you so much. It's hard. It must be hard to summarize all of this in a short, in this short amount of time. But I think yeah, it's really helpful also the idea here is also to motivate people, hopefully, to have a look at the survey and to also kind of find the information they need. I think especially, yeah, I think it's definitely a strength of the survey that it highlights sector specific outcomes. So when a director of a Catholic school might have other takeaways than a homeschooling family, you know? So, but I think the survey really
That's right.
reveals, yeah, just gives a lot of quality information to these different sectors. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And there is a section in the paper towards the end that really deals with sector specific highlights. So if you are a Catholic school leader or a homeschool leader, then you can certainly just kind of flip to the part that's relevant to you. But that certainly would help you to understand
Yeah.
what the outcomes are that are relevant to your particular sector.
Amazing. So you even did the work. You already did the work for everybody. So you have the results and you did that's amazing. That's so good. Okay.
Yes, while my colleagues did the work, I should be clear to say
There's
that.
always a team. There's always yeah, very good. So with all these outcomes, how does that and you mentioned it at the start, but maybe kind of to bring it to bring it to a close, to go back again to educational pluralism. How does these different outcomes from these different sectors, how does that inform educational pluralism? Or else put as well, somebody that advocates for freedom of education how what is how can we use these findings for that advocacy?
Sure. Yeah. I think the fact that this speaks to results of schooling, that we were able to isolate really a school sector effect,
Mhm.
is something that is really important in terms of advocating for educational pluralism. I think it speaks to findings that um, the finding that schooling that is aligned with particular values, so that this is also a principle that is advocated for in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all families should be able to access education that aligns with their values and that fundamentally aligns with their beliefs or their pedagogical desires for their children. And I think this study points to the reality that outcomes of those kinds of schooling are positive. And so often I think one of the challenges certainly that we face is a, a a fear that this type of schooling or schooling that is different maybe than district or public schooling options is something that contributes to the disruption of social cohesion, or that it contributes actually to segregation. And I think that these results really speak to the opposite of that, that there
Yeah.
is increased increase in civic capacity and in the desire to volunteer and to give back to communities, and that there are really positive holistic life outcomes for graduates of different school sectors. And so maybe I think we need to rethink how we think about schooling. That transforming education systems really means giving students the option to be educated amidst communities that they feel strong senses of belonging and
Yeah.
participation within, and that has actually really positive outcomes further along the line once they have transitioned into adulthood, and are able to then contribute to society in meaningful and positive ways.
Hmm. Amazing. Yeah. I think it really shows, like you said, there's not just one way, and there's not just one good way to
That's
good
right.
education. There's a variety of ways, and they should be sustained and should be encouraged. And I like what you said that the factor of belonging, that you actually have a place where you can belong, and that how important that that sense of belonging is also for the outcome, so that you cannot it's you cannot you don't belong in the same way to every in different settings. So I think it's I haven't thought of that the belonging aspect, which I think very interesting. Okay. Um, what else can we expect from Cardus in these coming months, maybe? What are you working on? What is what especially on the in the education department, what are you working on at the moment?
Sure. So, well, in terms of the Cardus Education Survey, we are hoping to, barring any unforeseen circumstances, but we are hoping to also do this survey again in Canada, in the Canadian context, in the near future. So we're working towards that. Um, and we also have on the go a variety of different projects around the role of independent school associations and their ability to sort of play a mediating role between government and independent schools to facilitate their quality, as well as um, their accountability to government as well. Um, we are looking at characteristics of emergent schools, particularly in the province of Ontario. So there have been a lot of new schools, independent schools that we have seen. And so we're looking at what are their characteristics, what are the characteristics of those people who have had the energy and drive to start these new schools. So really looking at kind of an emergent education landscape there, as well as a variety of different initiatives that are ongoing in terms of just understanding across the country the education that exists in different provinces and the extent of pluralism that exists in different Canadian provinces. So those are
Okay.
some of the things
Okay, so
that will be.
Canada and independent school associations, and stay tuned for there's going to be much more in the coming years, I assume. Because as
Yes,
you
I
said at the
should.
start, the work is not gonna end soon. Yeah. So and the interest in it and the need for it either. So
Yes,
just thank you
yeah,
so much from our side to your work, to the team. I know it's a whole team, to Cardus
yes,
for for really for bringing clarity in what is really happening on the ground, and put away some misconceptions as well, and give tools to the people on the ground, to the different sectors to actually know what to improve, where to focus on, to celebrate where their strength is, and then maybe work on some of the weaknesses. So I think this is this survey is helpful for many stakeholders. We definitely will use it at Oidel. So thank you so much, and all the best for the work and the work to come, the work ahead.
yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I should just probably give a shout out to my colleagues because it's really the Cardus Education Survey is their work. So I want to thank my colleagues Lynn Swanner and John Eckert and Albert Cheng for their work on it. And I hope that it's useful. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Joanna.
Take care, Josiane.